We are Community Radio Kilkenny City 88.7 FM.
You're very welcome to the Woman to Woman show here on Community Radio Kilkenny City. As many of our Woman to Woman show listeners know, the Woman to Woman show here on Community Radio Kilkenny City have been working together with Amber Women's Refuge, highlighting issues relating to the taboo subject and issues relating to women living or experiencing gender-based violence, especially within our homes, and domestic violence and domestic abuse. The nation is in shock at the horrific, brutal murder of a young, beautiful woman, a loving daughter, a sister, a cousin, a friend, and school teacher, and an active member within her community. Our thoughts and prayers go to Aisling Murphy's family, her friends, and her young school children up the road in Durham. Schools across Ireland observed a 1-minute silence yesterday. We need to change the societal and cultural narrative around the gender-based violence against women. The Kilkenny people said Aisling's murder raised questions about attitudes towards women. Also to point out, and it's a very important note, is not all men are violent against women. And there's an awful lot of advocates out there, male advocates, who are very vocal in their disgust and in their horror at domestic violence and violence against women, any violence against women. So there's an awful lot of feminist men out there who are really, really vocal in this area. So to point out that only because we here, Woman to Woman show, we talk about domestic violence and women's issues, doesn't mean to say that we're anti-men or anything else. In fact, we're quite the opposite. Many men actually go out of their way to help women in need and in fleeing domestic violence and helping them out in any way possible. There's also a need for the men to be more part of the narrative in calling out the issue and speaking up against violence against women publicly. On the Woman to Woman show's lineup on the panel today, we will be discussing violence against women, domestic violence, gender-based violence, and the attitude towards women within our society. And we need to change the narrative, the societal and cultural narrative about women in general. Orla Kenny, my former colleague here at Community Radio Kilkenny City, will be joining the panel who we have here on Community Radio Kilkenny City, and she also is the chair of the Fine Gael Carlow Kilkenny constituency. Orla's mum, Terry Kelly, set up the first women's refuge here in Ireland, which was in Limerick. She set it up with 3 friends in the late 70s, and as when things were particularly difficult for women at a time there was no divorce and the women were financially trapped in violent domestic relationships. At first it was all voluntary and fighting for women's rights, which led to her life in politics. Adapt is in Limerick is still helping women and children with the amazing range of services, and Orla's aunt is also Deirdre Clune, the MEP. Orla will be joining us later on in the telephone call, and in studio I have 2 very popular ladies with the Woman to Woman show as well, is indeed former Mayor and former Labour County Councillor Mary Fitzpatrick, and Stephanie McDermott, who is the lecturer in St Patrick's in Carlow in adversity, equality, and is a human rights activist as well. And on the phone to join us is Niamh Murphy, who is the communications officer with Amber Women's Refuge, is on the phone. Niamh Murphy, you are very welcome to the Woman to Woman show here on Community Radio Kilkenny City.
Thank you, Roisin. Good evening, and good evening to your panellists and your listeners.
Niamh, you are the communications officer with Amber. I think it might be the first time our listeners have heard you on the Woman to Woman show. It's a sad day for the nation, and it's a sad day for an awful lot of young women. I know myself, my daughter goes out running, and there was a quote out there saying she was out for a run. And Amber also have a quote saying she was in her own home. We were all at a loss last week in complete shock at the brutal and horrific murder murder of a young, beautiful woman. And we were all talking, the narrative has to change. The societal and cultural narrative about violence and about women in general has to change. From your Amber Woman's perspective, how can we here at the Woman to Woman show continue helping changing that narrative and highlighting women, violence against women? Your aspect is in as a refuge for women fleeing domestic violence, providing services and giving women a safe haven in their homes and also when they come to you. So, what is your message today and who is it to?
Roisin, I suppose first of all, we're all heart sick and heart sore, and we have been since we heard of Aisling's tragic murder last week. And, I suppose from ourselves, from our perspective as a domestic violence and abuse service locally in Kilkenny and Carlow, we deal with the effects of violence against women every day, unfortunately. And Aisling was going for a run. And as you referenced in your intro there, so many others, countless others, are simply living in their own home. 13% of women murdered in Ireland are murdered by a stranger, and so the 87% of women murdered in Ireland are murdered by their partner or ex-partner. And not putting the heart sickness or the devastation aside, but as a representative working in the domestic, sexual and gender-based violence sector frontline service in Ireland, we know it's time to galvanise the hurt and the shock and the dismay into action. And I suppose that's my key message coming on. Thanks for the invite, coming on and speaking to you and your listeners this evening, Roisin, is to not let this moment pass. This is a watershed moment where real change can be implemented from the top down and from the ground up. But we need sectors of our society to work with us to do that. So, firstly, I'd like to call again, speaking on behalf of Amber, but also the broader local frontline domestic violence and abuse services, call on government and call on legislators. There's lots of lip service. There's been even more lip service in recent days. But the stark fact of the matter is, domestic, sexual and gender-based violence, it doesn't have its own department. We're strung across a number of different departments. We are chronically underfunded. Amber itself, we're projecting a €200,000 loss this year, and that's just to keep essential refuge and community-based or outreach services, Roisin, that we operate for women and children living with domestic abuse in their homes across Kilkenny and County Carlow. That's just to keep the show on the road. That's not, allowing for the massive upswing in demand for services. That's not allowing for rising costs. We're part funded by one department, then funded by another, and that siloed approach is really stopping an ability for services to provide real impact and change at the ground level. So we definitely be calling for one department, one cabinet minister for this area. Violence against women, it was at pandemic levels before COVID came on the scene, and unfortunately it will continue at pandemic levels long after COVID is gone, and it's a dim and distant memory. Women will continue to be at risk in public spaces, as poor Aisling was, and in private spaces, that most sacred of space, which is supposed to be in women's homes, unless that begins and that process, that legislative process begins, and that the sector is properly and robustly and sustainably funded, that we're not going every year cap in hand to our funders, that real funding is put in place on a sustainable level so that we can plan and manage and roll out the services that are needed in our local communities nationally.
Niamh, would you be in the mindset on the thought, I have one and I've been putting it out there the last couple of days, do you think that maybe what we need here in Ireland is a ministry, a department for women and a minister for women here in Ireland? Because there's just so many debacles that are happening, from the cervical check, the mother and baby homes, childcare, and, you know, if everything was all under the one umbrella, that women's voices and women's health and issues, you know, they wouldn't be sidelined.
Well, it's very sad, isn't it, Roisin, that in 2022, in you know, what's considered a first world progressive country, that we would need a gender specific department. But unfortunately, for many of the reasons, you know, you've outlined some of them, you know, women continue to be second-class citizens in this country in terms of how they're treated by the health service, how they're treated by legislators, how they're treated by, you know, the Gardaí, the judiciary. So yes, there's certainly a massive lag in equality and in respect in terms of how women are treated in the country, which would lead you to believe that yes, certainly there may well be a need for a women's minister for women, you know, just dealing with these gender-based affairs. Yes,
and so. Really, the only people that can change legislation, that can really get to the heart and direct funding to, say, the domestic violence service here in Ireland, especially down to Ulster here in Kilkenny, because there's no refuge in Carlow, so in Kilkenny, is really the legislators, which is the politicians and the civil servants in Leinster House.
Absolutely, completely. There's been enough lip service, you know, in Aisling's memory and in memory of every other woman who's died violently in Ireland. This is now the moment, and the moment needs to be acted on. And, you know, unfortunately, in a number of weeks, people will, of course, have moved on with their lives. But we really all have to work together to use this as a moment, as I said, change from the top down in terms of our legislator and our cabinet, and change from the ground up. And remember, you know, it's people who put our legislators in place to make those decisions for us. So we need people to be vocal and to act on this, and to act in the next voting ballots if they feel that what the change that we really need to see implemented just isn't happening. And, you know, I'd also be calling on the listeners, you know, as you mentioned, we have so many male allies locally, but we need more. And we need that men, you know, it's not enough that men just don't use violence, but we need men and women not to excuse violence when they see it, and not be silent about violence when they see it, particularly in relation to domestic abuse. Until very recently, domestic abuse, and continues to be, but to a lesser extent, this kind of shameful thing that happened in the corner, and it always happened to someone other than me. But the statistics, you know, it's 1 in 4 women, it's 1 in 7 men in Ireland. Those statistics are above the EU averages, I will also say, Roisin. So, you know, this is completely endemic across all strata of our society. So, you know, it's as I said, change from the top down, and a legislative and a funding perspective, but change from the bottom up as well, with, you know, listeners, parents, starting conversations with boys and girls, educators, more programs needed on consent, equality and respect, you know, and they need to be at primary school level. We know they're at post-primary level. In fact, Amber, we're piloting a new program called Start Safe, which we hope to roll out to the local post-primary schools over the coming months. But, you know, I had a conversation recently with a lovely 11-year-old boy. We were talking about feminism, and I know this boy's family. And, you know, he said to me, and you know, his parents are so progressive and super and very, very equal home, you know, very focused on equality. And, you know, he said to me, but Niamh, I don't want to be a feminist. And I asked him why not, and he said, because feminists, you know, hate men. And I thought, there you are, 11. Where has this come from? Because I know it hasn't come from home. And I know that you're going to be speaking, you know, when I leave the show this evening, you're going to be speaking about changing the narrative, you know, at that level. But so it needs to be in very, very young, because unfortunately they're picking up these, outmoded and outdated biases and opinions and attitudes very, very early, much earlier, our children are, I think, than we perhaps realise.
And, I see Mary and Stephanie nodding in agreement there.
Yes, yeah, I mean, it's such a broad issue.
I would agree with that, and I would take one step further. I think any of our elected representatives that are taking it to Dublin, I feel that it is blocked at senior civil service level. There seems to be some kind of a communication there between our TDs and getting in directly at these ministers. The funding is another thing. Everybody is calling out for funding left, right and centre. There is plenty of money up there. Did I read that there's over 40 million in some accounts now that will be dispersed around? Why not set something up with that money around the country? And I agree wholeheartedly when the statistics that you gave out there too, and if memory serves me right, in the last couple of years, was it 244 women have been killed since 96, if I'm not mistaken.
Yes.
And I don't know how many men, because I wouldn't be privy to the stats on that, but it does go on. Men do get beatings from the females, but I don't think as much.
Well, certainly not, Mary.
Yeah,
not as much at all. And with Niamh there, absolutely the top-down, bottom-up approach. People call this attack, random. There was nothing random about it, in the sense that, we start with, the bottom, say, layer there, the local level, where we're all so used to microaggressions, and I know I've referenced this before in terms of microaggressions, where sexist comments about what people dress or how women dress, comments on how if they're out at night, the groping, the lewd, the wolf whistling, all of that. So it starts at that level, and then it just moves up. So if you think about a pyramid, it starts with the comments, the kind of not calling it out. And then by the time it gets up to the top of it, it's almost, it follows a pattern that up to the top that there is assaults and there is violence against women. And that's where it is not called out in any way. And there is a direct link, and I would say this, for every woman that has been attacked and been beaten, whether it's in her home or on the street, I would see a direct link between the legacy we have in Irish society, which is, think about how women have been treated in Irish society, the Madeleine laundries, the marriage bar, the glass ceiling, the just recently, the discussion around lack of affordable childcare. So that keeps women in the home, and it's like the private public thing. Men are the people who tend to represent the public, and it is women who often, because of lack of affordable childcare, lack of safe transport, lack of perhaps workplaces that are not, they have to start at 9, why not start at 9:30? So there's so many factors on this. So we have to break, I suppose, that legacy of how we treated women and how we have treated, and it goes without saying, and I get cross when people sidestep the issue and they talk about, but it's not all men. We're not talking about men here. We're talking about women who want to feel safe, who want to feel equal, and that is the bottom line. And it's interesting that Niamh talked about a young boy that she was speaking with, and he didn't want to be a feminist. There are different camps of feminists, but somehow feminism has been seen as this radical, these radical women that hate men. Feminism means equality, and you ask any man, lots of men, are you a feminist? No, I'm not a feminist. Do you believe in equality? In fact, I'd go further. You ask women, some women refuse to call themselves feminists.
It's become a dirty word.
It's become a dirty word. But why has it become a dirty word? Because it's the association of these very radical women that, of course, Western society is afraid of. They're afraid of women that rock the boat. And even we go back to Mary Robinson, and it was wonderful that she was elected Manon Éireann and President of Ireland. But there were so many people that didn't agree with that and were shaking their heads and, it's never going to be the same again. And you think about Mary Robinson and the strong woman, and we have so many strong women, not just at that level, but in our communities, who probably have never been given a chance, who probably have never been elevated to the way that their brothers have been or their fathers have been. And this has a huge impact on the self-esteem of women. And you know that women tend to be much more, I suppose, cagey about taking on responsibility, because they always question, I don't know if I'm able for it, whereas you often find, am I right, Barry?
I agree 100%.
You often find that men, and there's research been done on this, that men will go into an interview and they will sell themselves, no problem, but a woman will not tends not to lie about her abilities. And if you think about women and all the managing they have done, the resilience they have shown, the compromises they have had to make, I mean, women, and both genders are wonderful, there's no question about that, but let's not sidestep the issue that it's not all men. We're not talking about men anymore. We're talking about women and girls feeling safe, and that's really the bottom line. And I have also heard this week, and I did think about it, where lots of women and lots of men have said, I have daughters at home. They have sons at home. The conversation.
It should be around the kitchen table, and they should be talking about, respect. Now, going back to the feminism, I don't know if you three ladies, Niamh and Stephanie and Mario, agree with me. I think the real feminism and the real champions of women were in our history, from the suffragettes, and before that, the suffragettes. And when you think for the women from our own history, the 1916 Rising, the 1921, and then we were airbrushed out of the photographs.
That's right, and never discussed. And while it might be recorded, the amount of work that they put in and the supports that they were in the background, I've never come across a book that actually states only for women and only for women. This wouldn't have happened.
Absolutely. I mean, we can talk about the leaders in our country years ago, but what about the women in the tenements? What about the women who went up and downstairs with bags of coal?
Yes.
What about all of these women who had no choice but to have child after child after child after child? I mean, these are the women that we are standing on their shoulders, and it's really incumbent upon all of us to make that society, just our society, a better society for everyone. Like, it's not a debate about who's stronger or who's better.
No.
Like, we have to move on. We just have to move on. And I think Niamh mentioned it too, in terms of resources. In the UK, there are much more resources going to men's sexual health than women's reproductive research. Now, it's 5 times more. 5 times more. So that is an indication of where women are placed on the hierarchy. So I think it's just a matter of, I suppose it's evidence, this is the evidence. This is the evidence. So we've got to do something about that. We really have to do something about that.
Well, Niamh, I know you have to go. You have children to pick up, but thank you so much for coming on and representing the Amble Women's Refuge. We really appreciate that, and I'm sure we'll be hearing your voice a lot more in 2022 here on the Woman to Woman show.
Roisin?
Yes.
Before I go, could I just please mention our helpline number?
Do, yes. Sorry.
If there's anyone listening any woman listening who is experiencing domestic violence, our helpline number, 24/7 number, 0818 424244, and indeed to any men experiencing domestic violence, the Men's Aid helpline, 01-554 3811. Thank you so much, Roisin.
And you're on all the social media outlets as well.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. We're going to go for a short break, and coming back, we'll be joined on the panel a former colleague of mine, Orla Kelly, and who's also the chair of the local Carlow Kilkenny Fine Gael constituency, and also the daughter of the woman who first set up the very first women's refuge here in Ireland, and that was in Limerick, and that was Terry Kelly. So do stay tuned after the break. You're very welcome to the Woman to Woman show here on Community Radio Kilkenny City. I am joined on the panel by Stephanie McDermott, lecturer in equality and diversity and a human rights activist, and Kilkenny's very own former mayor and Labour County Councillor Mary Fitzpatrick. And before the break, we were talking to the Niamh Murphy of the Amber Women's Refuge. And on the line now I'm speaking to my former colleague Orla Kelly, who is also a beautiful and amazing interior designer. And
I thought I was just going to be beautiful, Rosie.
You are beautiful inside and out, Orla.
Thank you, Rosie.
You're also you ran in the local elections, in the last local elections, and you are also the chair of the Carlow Kilkenny Fine Gael constituency. Orla, you're very welcome back to the Woman to Woman show.
Thank you, Roisin. It's a pleasure. It's a very dark week that we're all discussing these issues, but it's good to have the opportunity to talk about them, yeah.
And a lot of our listeners and a lot of our panellists who we've had over the years would not be familiar with the fact that your mum, your lovely mother, who I never met, but I say I'd love to have met her, Terry Kelly, set up the very first women's refuge here in Ireland, down in Limerick.
Yeah, she did. So there were herself and three friends of hers, and they were just really concerned because at the time, I know some people might find it hard to imagine, but there was no divorce. So if women were in abusive relationships, whether it was violence or coercive control, they were really, really stuck in these relationships because there was no concept of selling the house or dividing the house or being financially independent. So there was this pattern of abuse and violence against women. So Terry, my mother, and three friends of hers, Helen McCarthy, Nancy Punch and Jude Cahill, got together and they got an old building near St. John's Hospital for a refuge. But literally as young kids, we would sometimes have to go out in the night time, and if my mother was at home alone, we would literally be collecting a woman and maybe two or three of her children who were climbing over the back wall of a house while the husband was literally battering down the front door to get at them. So it was one of the, I think it was the first women's refuge in Ireland, but I stand to be corrected on that. But I mean, it's great that the Adapt House still works in Limerick now, and they have fantastic facilities and services, and they've just done a programme with the Gardaí, because a lot of the Gardaí have always had this question about, like, why would a woman stay? So a lot of the women who have been in the shelter have workshopped with the Gardaí, saying this is what coercive control is, this is how hard it is to escape. And basically that kind of mutual sharing of information is really, really important. And the services that are being offered, are brilliant, but it's unfortunate that the problem is growing.
And also, when you think, Orla, from your perspective as a professional woman and a woman who has been involved in helping women flee and from domestic violence all your life, probably from the cradle, and what would your perspective be on the narrative and the societal narrative and culture of women living with domestic violence and women in general?
Well, it's extraordinary to think that in very recent times it was still completely legal to rape your wife in Ireland. That seems unbelievable. So a lot of it was what went on behind closed doors was nobody's business, and I think people and society still has a problem in reporting that. I think there's also, the amount of stories that emerged this week it's great to get them aired, but every single woman can list 10 to 50 times that they have been abused, verbally abused, sometimes sexually abused, sometimes violence, groping. It's just absolutely endemic, and I think it's much, much worse than it was 30 years ago. So there's a massive problem around education that has to start obviously in schools and go all the way through, education of frontline workers. And frontline workers are a huge cohort of people. I mean, they've just done a survey in Utrecht in Holland saying that, that an awful lot of women who are being abused, you'd know this as a dog lover, Roisin, yourself, that their pet has been violently abused or even killed beforehand, and a lot of women won't leave a relationship because, they're afraid of the dog being killed when they go or whatever. So, like at the moment, the vets are being trained as, if a dog comes in or a pet comes in with a lot of violence, that they would see that as a trigger, that there's probably violence and domestic abuse going on in the house. So that's a big study that's happening in Utrecht at the moment, so much so that they've opened a shelter in Amsterdam to give women time to get out of the abusive relationship and rehouse themselves and get their pet back. So when you think of the huge broad spectrum around the kind of abuse that's happening, social media has obviously made it more prevalent. I think, the elephant in the room is that there are boys and girls from a much younger age having much more access to porn, which is, as a general rule, the images of the subjugation of women. There's no discussion of consent, and you think of just this perfect storm, but it all starts around legislation, obviously, the sentencing for these kind of crimes and the clarity around sentencing, but massively around education that just has to start so much younger. So that if kids are watching porn, you have to say what's going on here is not a realistic scenario. That's not what you should expect, and that's not what you should demand. So it's very difficult, but I mean, we have to really tackle it now head on.
Stephanie,
in many facets.
I'm nodding my head here, Orla. Absolutely. I mean, I spoke earlier about microaggressions, and it's sad to think that you think things have gotten worse for women and girls, and I'm tending to think that as well. If young boys and young girls are given phones with unlimited access to internet and downloads of porn, which they will, of course, because young people are very curious, it very much distorts what a relationship should be and what is expected of a relationship, and the objectification of women. And coercive control, all of that. And we have the most recent is the the sexing and the spiking of drinks and all of that. And now I think it's moved on to just a very indiscreet little needle in the arm, which will then have women almost falling asleep and not remembering what goes on. So there's all of this, but really it's about power, and it's about the power that men can have over women. And I am refusing to say some men, because that's a given. We know that's a given. So it is about, coercive control. It's about the power. And I think that if men could just put aside being, feeling like they're victims now in the last week, if they could just put that aside and think about the reality for women. So men who go jogging worry about the traffic, the rain, or someone on a bike splashing them, whatever, but women, it's a very, very different. So it's all very gendered. And I think also in terms of, what we should be doing, everything should be gender proofed. Every building should be gender proofed. Street lighting, all of that should be gender proofed. And another thing I was just thinking about was that, when we talk about the inferior position of women, but think about any woman who's getting married. Her father or her brother gives her away to another man. And I know people will say, but that's tradition. And of course it's tradition, and people want the traditional wedding sometimes in a church, and that's wonderful. It's a wonderful occasion. But some of us, we need to start questioning, what message does that send, with the woman in the beautiful white dress, walked up the aisle, and there you go, the hand is shook to the son-in-law. There you go, there she is now. Look after her well. And it all might seem quite innocent, But, you know, you think about any woman's funeral, it is always men that are on the altar. Women do not share the altar with priests. And that's another, I suppose, just another indication of the elevation of men in society. And I am far from being, I love men. I have a son, I have a husband, I have 6 brothers, you know, lots and lots and lots of really good friends. But it's just pointing out the reality here and how that might feel for a woman who wants a traditional wedding, but, you know, has to go through the kind of the brother or the husband giving her away. And why not the mother go up the aisle sometimes? You know, we see these things and we don't question them because it's so ingrained in society. It's so ingrained, and it's lovely now to see, you know, sometimes a hurling game in Nolan Park, where you see families and women going to these games now. 20 years ago, you didn't see that.
Oh no, you were at home getting the dinner.
You were home getting the dinner.
To have it on the table when they came back, you know.
Isn't it wonderful though that now you see, and now stadiums have toilets for women. You know, when you think about it.
Did they not have them before?
There may be one toilet at the other end of the pitch.
At the far end with no flush.
Yeah.
You know, you might be.
So this is, now things certainly have improved. They have changed. But I think if you look at the ratio of female toilets to male toilets in any of these stadiums, you know, there are questions to be asked.
And what is really now in 2022? We're in 2022. You know, we have to stop the misogyny within our communities, within our workplace, and within the professional area of women and families. How do we do that?
As adults, I think we need to call it out when we see it, and we need to be backing one another up. If there is more than one or two women calling it out, and if there's men around, they need to stand in to help as well. You know, and we can help each other. Education, I think, at primary school level. We've all had brothers at home when an argument would start and the boys would make a run at you. Yes. And your mother would say, "Stop, enough now, you're too rough." You know, and that would be the end of it. It would be making faces at each other after that. But in today's world, I have found there's an awful amount of violence, but then they have access to violence at a very early age. Even the cartoons can be quite violent. And they're learning. So we need to, again, it starts in the home. Everything starts in the home. We need to sit down, talk to them, have a real conversation, continue to have the conversation. Primary schools as well. And once they get to secondary schools, sure, they think the world is their own.
And that's another kind of bugbear of mine, I suppose. When I look at the system in Irish society, you know, the segregation of schools, I really don't think that is healthy when it comes to secondary school or primary school for that reason. And I, you know, the whole boys will be boys culture. And Mari is right. You know, we have to start having the conversations, but let's call them what they are: difficult conversations. You know, if we're all watching a movie together, and whether it's Pocahontas or whether it's Snow White or whatever it is, you know, let's talk about, well, you know, why is she in that role? Why do you think it's a woman that's in that role? You know, so there's lots of things we can do, lots and lots of things.
Well, we're going to go for now. Sorry, Orla. Go ahead, Orla.
Yeah, no, just I think very briefly, one of the most alarming things was this spiking with syringes that started off and became hugely prevalent. It was in London and Belfast, and then suddenly it was in Cork and Dublin a week later. That, in my mind, should have been a massive national response that nightclubs had to search every single person's bag going in, and that had to be done in every single nightclub, otherwise you couldn't open. Even more strict than a COVID thing, because that is the kind of behaviour that is completely misogynistic, brand new, and just have to be wiped out immediately, nipped at the bud. If it's extra staff, extra money, whatever, it just has to be done.
Yeah, because I'm terrified. My daughter's 30. I'll never be a grandmother, but my daughter's 30, and you know, she's still going out to the nightclubs and the dating scene. And it's like, if she has a date, it's like, text me when you're finished, text me when you're home, text me if you're going to a nightclub, text me. And I actually, even though I know she's not going to, I actually keep checking during the night that she's been on WhatsApp, and that I know if she's been on WhatsApp, she's okay. That is where I am. As a mother, and she's 30. And
I never stop worrying about them.
It's replicated throughout.
Well, she's 30 this month, at the end of the month. Yeah,
it's replicated throughout society, and I suppose what we'd ask ourselves in that situation: do we do the same when our sons are out?
No, yeah.
No, I don't.
Very true.
I don't. And it's an
for
exchange.
there to be very new and dangerous risks in just going out for women in the last 2 months, since this has started, is like, that's really alarming, that kind of threat to women. And I just do not think there was a radical enough response by the industry, or the industry has been very vocal about COVID, and I admire that and I appreciate their position. But I do think as an industry they should have come out together and saying, we are having zero tolerance policy of this new threat to women, because women are 50% of their core customers. That kind of threat to women would not be ignored in any other business or industry or sector of society.
No.
And even too with my daughter, if she's walking at night time on her own, she phones me and we talk until she gets home.
Yes.
That's ridiculous.
It's about protection. It's
Yeah.
about your protection, and
Feeling safe.
Feeling safe, and for you willing her to put the key in the door to come in.
Yeah.
And it nothing might have ever happened to her, but the threat is still there. And I have to say, I think it's pathetic that some of these men that are out there with these injections going around, that they have to resort to that to meet a girl, because they're not men.
No.
They're cowards. And
Completely.
that needs to be said to them. They are cowards.
Well, we're going to go for
Well,
it.
again, that's not even meeting a girl. That's back to the previous point. That's power, control, coercive control and violence. That's not even, that's not, it's a misnomer even to call it meeting someone. It's just terrifying that's, that's now become a part of a social night out.
Yeah. Well, we're going to go for a quick ad break. Although you'll stay on until to the end of the show, I hope. And
I will indeed,
we'll
Roisin.
go to a quick ad break, and we'll be back, and we'll be in conversation with Orla Kelly, with Stephanie McDermott and Mary Fitzpatrick right after the break.
We are Community Radio Kilkenny City 88.7 FM.
You're very welcome back to the Woman to Woman show here on Community Radio Kilkenny City, where we're discussing about the tragic death of a young woman within a wider community up there in Portlaoise, but he was a teacher in Durrow. And also we were talking about the how we need to change the societal and cultural narrative around women in general and against violence against women. And during the off-air during the break, we were talking, Orla, Stephanie and myself, we were talking about. And also it started off as well, at the beginning of the programme, Niamh from the Amber Women's brought that up, is we need to change this at legislative level, within government and within the courts. Orla, I'll come to you first on that one.
Well, it's like the legislation and the court reporting around all of this violence against women isn't working for women. So when you think of, like, there's 1 in 5 women in Ireland who suffer domestic abuse, and 1 in 3 who suffer psychological abuse by a partner. So that means they're in a relationship that they think is safe. Now, the really interesting thing is that 70% of Irish women have reasons for not seeking help after an attack. And that is at 53% across all other European countries. So what you're seeing there is that there's either society or, structural problems, or the pathway to getting help is either not there, or people feel as though, and a lot of the time it's like they don't want to disrupt the family, the wider family, society. They don't want to, own up to abuse, because a lot of the time they think it's their fault, and then they would appear weak, or, there's so many reasons. So that 53%, that's in the rest of Europe, that women do feel as though they should get help or report it, is so much higher now. So women in Ireland are not reporting it.
Yeah.
They're not looking for help. And I know the various women's agencies have now go for legal help to help you through the court system, but our sentencing is very poor. It doesn't reflect well when women go to court. They don't they don't feel as though, a lot of them, they don't feel as though they're getting justice. So a huge amount of that is training, so that before women become a victim of domestic or abuse or misogyny or workplace bullying or anything, that there has to be an education program in schools, in the sports clubs, you know, wherever you can throughout society, a national program that both men and women listen to, and they say, look, this is an example of coercive control.
Absolutely.
This is an example of bullying in the workplace. And there's an interesting program actually that they have an Adapt in Limerick, which is a program for family members who report abuse for women who can't. So as a family member or a friend, you can say, I know my friend, sister, whoever is being abused. I know they're in an abusive relationship. I know they're in coercive control. So there's now that helpline set up as well, so that women, for a multitude of reasons, who don't feel they can report it, that now there's help, that family members can say, this is going on, how do I intervene? How do I get them help? How do I become the link?
And Orla, could I ask, is there a possibility for that to be replicated throughout the country? Because I would know of many, I know of some cases that where women have gone to a friend to tell about perhaps coercive control or whatever, and that friend really can't do anything. So do you think there could be a possibility that something like that could be rolled out?
That would be fantastic. I mean, you know, obviously I'm going to look into all of this, but you know, that's a program that's just that you phone in. So that's on the Adapt. It's a service that they offer in Limerick, but there are so many services that you can see, so it has to be from school, and then of course it's the friend, you're right, who normally both knows and then is told. And then there's a whole legal and a societal thing around, is it my business? And I think that's a lot of what we have to break down in Ireland.
Absolutely. I mean, I think as a woman, when you look at the way court cases have gone in the past and what women have had to do to attempt to prove their innocence, or that they have been the victim and hopefully survivor of abuse, you know, they're judged by the newspapers, they're judged by the people in the court. People are there, some people in very high profile cases brought their knitting as if this was a show to look at, in terms of a girl almost being torn apart on the stand. So, you know, I think for women, perhaps they don't see that, well, what's going to happen? You know, my name is going to be in the paper, and nobody likes their name in the paper.
And, you know, they can produce my underwear. And it is basically, I mean, that system in itself just appears to be so misogynistic. I have to say I do have great faith in Helen McAtee in the way she's gone about this, you know, starting off with just not being able to, you know, have revenge, you know, private porn, images that people put online. And she has a program now which she had been working on before, which are, you know, the 5 Ps, and she's going to work through this whole protection of women on so many levels. But I think it has to be that all that legislation has to be backed up by a complete sea change in society, which is to do with a shift in behaviour and education, but it's to do with all of us having a conversation, and as you say, having a conversation in difficult places. Because it's fine with your women friends, everyone goes, oh, this happened to me, and everyone can tell a story about literally some man feeling them up when they were either in a sweet shop as a kid or in a, you know, in a swimming pool or whatever. And the thing is, we don't actually have those discussions in more professional situations, or we don't have them if there's other men around. And I just think it's like an omerta, and we have to break that silence.
Yep. Absolutely. Absolutely. And you know, not just, we talk about, you know, conversations around the kitchen table or whatever, but conversations in clubs and societies right throughout Ireland. And I think that's, you know, we're not going to move any way forward if we don't have those difficult conversations, and we just have to have the discussion, and let this be part of it, and let the Murphy family mourn now, and just, you know, let them mourn. Stay away from them in peace, and let everyone else do the work.
Yeah, Mary, you know, you've been a long. We've got less than a minute, but you have been a long advocate for here as a politician in Kilkenny for women's
Well,
rights.
I suppose, Roisin, I always called it as I saw it, you know, and that didn't make quite a few people happy.
It never does.
No, and, but I have to say, around the issue of domestic violence in Kilkenny, our Kilkenny Gardaí are wonderful and they're a very good support, and I have that on the best of authority.
Well, unfortunately, we've run out of time. We could go on for another hour talking about this issue. I would like to thank all of you on the phone for coming in and talking to us about it, and many, many congratulations to your late mother. It's definitely an inspiration for us all, and thank you so much indeed.
Thanks, Roisin.
Thank you,
Bye,
Orla.
Orla.
And I would like to thank Stephanie McDermott and Maya Fitzpatrick and Niamh Murphy from the Women's Refuge. We run out of time.
We are Community Radio Kilkenny City 88.7 FM.